Excellent. So here we are. You can hear me well. You're well seated. You're comfy after a wonderful day already here that we are all having. Thank you very much for joining us. In case you didn't realize which session you had joined, remember that we are in the session that is a win-win for climate and development, envisioning the future of multilateral development financing in transport. We are here to have quite an interesting conversation, as you can imagine. This is a session that has been organized by the BMZ, jointly with the FCDO, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank. We have been talking all these days about how sustainable transport can actually be crucial for getting us out of some of the interconnected challenges that we are living as humankind, isn't it? But the reality is that the investment is lagging. It's not really following the path that is needed. And it is estimated that governments globally are facing something like a $40 trillion financial gap for transport infrastructure until 2040. And that is actually bigger than the energy, telecom and water sectors combined in terms of the financial gap that we are having. That is tremendous. And it's not just about infrastructure for the sake of it. It's actually infrastructure because what we are pursuing here is more access to transport and mobility for more people. We are pursuing the reduction of emissions. We are pursuing transport infrastructure that is better adapted and is more resilient to the extreme weather events and the global shocks that we are also seeing. And of course, we also have got the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is putting us under a lot of pressure as well in the type of infrastructures that we want to be seeing going forward. So none of these contexts is actually making it easier for governments to be able to deploy the type of funding that we would like to see in order to overcome this financing gap in transport infrastructure. So this is precisely where large multilateral financiers can come in, and they can provide the building blocks for supporting governments in some of these challenges and in precisely making the flows of investment in transport infrastructure going in the right way to create jobs, to provide more access, more equitable access, to help reduce emissions, and the long list of challenges that we can turn into opportunities that we have been talking about. So in this session, very much we're going to be looking into a series of questions that are a bit as a backdrop for all of us. So how can international financial institutions act on these challenges with solutions that would really speak to the needs of all income groups in our societies, and particularly in low and middle income countries? How can we assure that the value of public goods and intangible goods is actually captured in the valuation approaches and systems that we got in order to decide whether an investment is worth or not? Are there any examples of principles that are being used out there, or standards for transport infrastructure investment that optimize sustainable prosperity that we could be looking into and incorporating and scaling up a bit more widely? How can we boost bankable projects that help us leverage synergies between transport, energy, health and employment towards this notion of a just transition from carbon intensive infrastructures that we have seen so far? And of course, how can we increase the cooperation between international financial institutions so we boost the number of bankable projects that are truly aligned with Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals targets? So those are very much the questions that are at the backdrop of this session that we have here today. My name is Marusha Kardama. I am the Secretary General of SLOCAT. In case you are not familiar with SLOCAT, you can think about us as the multi-stakeholder international partnership that works at the intersection of transport, climate, and sustainability. But as you can see, I'm not here alone today, and that's the good news. We have an amazing panel with us that obviously is consistent as well of some of the co-organizers of this session. So shortly we will be joined on stage by Benjamin Jeromin, who would give us some welcome remarks. He's Senior Policy Officer in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ. To my immediate left, we got with us Ben Simmons, who is Director of Sustainable Infrastructure in the International Institute for Sustainable Development. If I skip the two ladies that are here with us today, we have got Jamie Leather, who is the Chief of Transport Sector Group in the Asian Development Bank. If I move to Jamie's left from where you're sitting, we have got with us Anne Joslin, who is Infrastructure Advisor in the Research and Evidence Directorate in the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Then we have Lies Weidner with us, who's the Head of the Road Division in the European Investment Bank. And last but not least, somebody that by now you know very well, we got with us Ben Ringer, who is the Global Practice Manager in the World Bank. So with no further ado, this is the opportunity for us to listen to Benjamin Jeromin from the BMZ. Please, Benjamin, welcome us. And a bit of applause, please. Let's warm it up a bit.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the session at the late afternoon of the second day of Transforming Transportation. Thank you, Marisha, for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure and honor to co-organize this panel and be part of it here at the World Bank's premises. Please excuse my voice. Many excellent conversations and the cold winds of Washington, D.C. have made a little bit effect on my voice. I would just like to give some brief welcoming words and my view on this topic in order to set the scene for an undoubtedly interesting conversation on the panel. So let me start by saying that while the question of how to reconcile climate and development goals in transport investments is not entirely new, I consider that it's a very timely debate and there's an urgent need to discuss it. Why? First, because we live in a situation, we live a moment of multiple crises which all have their effect and are partly created also by the transport sector. Just to mention one of the multiple global crises, the climate change, the climate crisis, of course, is the most evident. And to cite the last IPCC report, the transport sectors are one of the very few sectors where the emissions are still growing without the growth rate slowing down, so it's still growing by approximately 2% per year. So that is one. There is really urgency for that to speak about it. The second is that we are obviously at the eve of the Agenda 2030 halftime evaluation. And this year at the SDG evaluation, both the SDG 9, Sustainable Cities, and the SDG 11, Industry Innovation, will be at the heart of the discussions. So it's a moment of stock taking, it's a moment of transparency, and I think it's no secret that we're not on track for the goals of the Agenda 2030. And last but not least, I think we can link all that to the discussions around the World Bank reform. In only a couple of weeks here, we will have the World Bank's spring meetings to discuss this. The World Bank has presented their evolution roadmap last year, end of last year. And one of the key questions that is going to be discussed around the World Bank reform is the question of how to integrate global public goods or global challenges into the World Bank's business model. And that's, of course, something that we want to discuss today. So the mobility, that's a second gap. And there's maybe a third gap, which we might call a transformational gap, so or an ambition gap, or to be discussed. But the essence of this is that we see that when there are transport investments, certain sectors or certain forms of transport investments are not sufficiently represented. And just to cite an example, active mobility still does make up only a small part of the portfolios. So what are we speaking about when we say we have to align both climate and development goals or global public goods? Of course, climate is at the heart of the discussion, Paris alignment, and the EIB, Lise Weidner is here, is leading the way and has already, back in 2019, decided not to invest in fossil fuel assets anymore. But there are other, of course, I have to mention the World Bank, which is Paris aligning 100% of their portfolio starting July this year. So this is really a huge step forward. But we have to see also the other global challenges or global public goods that are linked to transport. I will just name a few: health, equity, access to labor market, safety, food security, even macroeconomic stability, as we're seeing these days. And I am convinced that when we integrate all these global public goods into the equation, we will have different transport investments. But how do we get there? So this is really the complicated part, and I think it's not, I wish we could answer it fully today, but I think we would need more time. But I think we need action on different levels. It goes from general principles such as the G20 quality infrastructure principles, which serve as a political reference for ambition, policies or paths of ambition, such as the World Bank's Climate Change Action Plan, classification systems or regulatory frameworks such as the EU taxonomy. And of course, we also need civil society's contribution. SLOCAT is currently working on what they call a future-aligned gold standard to transport investment. That will definitely be another important contribution to the debate. And then there's the operative level, the operational level. So how do we change the way investment decisions are made? I know that the HTM4, through the road management software tool, is currently being updated. Maybe Anne-Jocelyn will speak about it later. I will cite another example from ISD. They have a tool which is called Sustainable Asset Valuation, which allows to include externalities into the financial cost-benefit calculation of transport or other sectors, infrastructure investments. For example, health, safety, environmental health, job creation, etc. And the results are pretty stunning, because when you put a financial value, for example, to health improved through a reduction in road accidents, the case for, to come back to my earlier example, for active mobility becomes quite clear. So I think we have we need the general principles, we need the regulatory framework, but we also need concrete operational tools for decision making which can inform investment decisions. Well, what else to do? Of course, speak about it, put it on the agenda. And that's what we're doing today, so I'm looking very much forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Much appreciated. I know you're staying with us here on the first row, and then you could be available for questions and comments, of course, as we move into discussing with you. Because we have made a pledge here in this panel, which is that we're going to keep it relatively short in our responses, so you get a bit of the landscape of what's going on by the hands of these very prominent entities, and then we're going to go to you. So start already thinking about what you'd like to ask, what you would like to comment, because we're really counting on you to make this a true conversation, and not just a panel, isn't it, at which we speak. But we're going to start talking first about precisely, Benjamin, you introduced this notion of a global good. And of course, when you're talking about something as a global good, there's many different parameters that you have to integrate in the evaluation and in the valuation calculations in order to assess the cost and benefits analysis of whether it is worth going here or not. And you also need to do it with a life cycle approach. And this is precisely what IISD has been doing with the sustainable asset valuation that Benjamin was talking about. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Ben, please? So we get a bit more familiar with what are the difficulties precisely of integrating these different parameters.
Sure, thanks Marusha. And I mean, you've taken integrated assessment and integrated cost-benefit analysis to a new level of excitement. Just the way you described it was a way that I hadn't seen described in the past. So for those of you that aren't familiar, IISD is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It's a global think tank. It's based in Canada and in Switzerland. Our work to date on sustainable infrastructure has really been driven by what we see are two major challenges, and I think Benjamin highlighted both of these in his remarks, but we've heard them repeated throughout the conference. The first is that there is generally a lack of good bankable projects for many of the sustainable transport activities and projects that are taking place. And part of the reason for this, at least part of the reason that we see that's creating this challenge, is really a lack of information that can make the case for investment. And the second major challenge, which is really quite related, and Benjamin, you highlighted this in your remarks, is that there seems to be a disconnect, if you will, between the commitments that governments and institutions are making at the global level and those values that are embedded and reflected in those commitments, and the values that are reflected actually in the principal economic and financial decision-making documents that we use when making decisions of whether to go forward with an infrastructure project and a transport project. And so we saw these two challenges, and that's why we focused and have focused for the last decade our efforts in a really very, very narrow space, I have to say, in terms of infrastructure and transport infrastructure. And that's on trying to look at cost-benefit analysis and financial modeling and think through, are there ways to do that differently? Are there ways to reopen that to think again on those fundamental models that allow us to make those financial and economic decisions? decisions. And so that's what we've been principally focused on. As you mentioned, we've created this sustainable asset valuation methodology. It includes a number of different tools. It includes cost-benefit analysis, it includes financial modeling, it includes also work looking at systems dynamic modeling, and we've worked on that to support the infrastructure projects. Our efforts to date have been principally focused for the last decade outside of the context of transport. It's only really been within the last 2 years that we've focused much more on the transport infrastructure, and that's with the support of the Federal Ministry of Germany. So it's through that support of the Federal Ministry that we've been able to do that. We're in the process of developing now 9 case studies looking at various types of sustainable transport projects around the world. We have case studies, for instance, in Indonesia, Colombia, Senegal, and India. For instance, we're looking in Coimbatore, India. We're looking at they have a new non-motorized transport plan that they're planning to implement. As many of you know, and it's been recounted on many occasions in this conference, the challenges associated with congestion. So they've developed a plan to produce create 300 kilometers of lanes, pedestrian and bicycle lanes over a 15-year period. And so for that project, we conducted both what I would say is a traditional cost-benefit analysis that looks at the direct costs and benefits, and then also an integrated cost-benefit analysis that looks at many of the sort of non-direct, indirect costs and benefits, including things, for instance, like the health benefits from shifting to non-motorized transport, including the time savings from reduced commuting, and so this whole range of costs and benefits we've looked at. Just to take a step back, when we conduct much of our work to support these integrated assessments, there's several sort of steps, if you will, that we take in conducting these. And the first, which is the most critical, I would say, is really in the identification of those potential externalities. And we do this through engagement with various stakeholders. Various stakeholder groups, including the project proponents, but also those communities that will be ultimately impacted by the transportation project. And then based on the identification of those impacts and those externalities, we incorporate those into the models. And then go back to the stakeholders and ensure that they feel like those models actually reflect their concerns. Then we run the models. We then value the impacts from those models, and ultimately then try to communicate the results of those models. In the end, it allows us to provide the stakeholders with a sense of comparing different types of infrastructure projects, so we can look at traditional road infrastructure versus a non-motorized transport infrastructure, for instance. Just wanted to give an example of some of the results that we've been able to reach. In Coimbatore, what we've seen, for instance, is when we run the traditional cost-benefit analysis, that project, in fact, ultimately did not look like it was economically viable. Had a benefit-to-cost ratio of around 0.47. However, when you begin to incorporate the other costs and benefits and the other externalities, we found that it was nearly 4.75 benefit to cost ratio, so nearly 10 times the benefit.
Wow.
And one might imagine, you might say, well, this is partly because it's non-motorized transport, so you would anticipate that the benefits would be less, right? Because you have less income stream, less cash flow. But in fact, what we're seeing is that the other projects that we're supporting as well, which include beyond non-motorized transport, so including mass rapid transport systems or bus rapid transport systems, very similar results. And so I think when you start to look at that and you see there's a massive difference between 10 times, 20 times in terms of value, it really does beg the question, are we doing ourselves a disservice when we're evaluating sustainable transport projects? Are we doing ourselves a disservice by relying only on traditional financial and economic analysis and modeling?
Wow, the message is very, very strong here, isn't it? 10 times to 20 times the difference, depending on what criteria you introducing in there. But you also use three key words that, for me, send a lot of message here. You talk about the information available, and therefore what is it that we are using to then carry the assessment. You talk about the values that somehow are at the roots of what we are valuing, and therefore what are we looking to promote or not. And then you talk about the communities, involving the communities as well, to make sure that we are really meeting those needs. So thanks very much, Ben, much appreciated. I'm pretty sure that our audience here in person and online, you're already starting to think like, wow, what a massive difference, isn't it, depending on what angle do we use for these valuations. We're going to have now another big conversation, isn't it, Lise? And it's a conversation about the incumbent fossil fuel infrastructure in transport and how we move away from it, but with that notion of an equitable transition. So tell us a bit, how is the European Investment Bank going about it? Of course, there was a lot of discussion around the European taxonomy, we know it. So where are we standing today? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So at the European Investment Bank, we have become increasingly ambitious in the fight against climate change over the last 4 years. This development is happening, as we've discussed here in many of the sessions, against a major change in the policy and regulatory framework in the European Union. The European Commission has decided that we are going to reduce greenhouse gases emissions significantly by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality on the continent in 2050. Historically, EIB is one of the largest lenders in the transport sector. Mobility has been financed by us since '58. And last year, we had total lending in the sector of around 11 billion euros, which is slightly below the average over the last 10 years. We account for about 18% of the total lending in the bank. In recent years, and thanks to the policy changes that I will come into a little bit later, climate finance in transport as a percentage has increased in 2021 and 22 to 80% of our portfolio, despite us becoming increasingly stricter. Transport remains a key focus of the bank. Our change started, as Benjamin mentioned, in 2019 when the bank decided in its new energy lending policy to stop financing of fossil fuel projects. And this was followed up later in the same year by the board that decided to increase significantly our commitment to environment and climate. And in 2020, we approved the Climate Bank roadmap, which was basically going to ensure that we were aligning all our financing activities to the principles and goals of the Paris Agreement. So what we did at the Climate Bank roadmap was to translate the overall policy direction to climate neutrality into what it means at operational or individual project level by asking ourselves, considering each subsector's different decarbonization goals, how do we achieve the overall decarbonization that we are aiming to, and how do we translate this into eligibility requirements for each of the projects to make sure that they are Paris aligned. The result of this process is outlined in our CBR. It's a publicly available document on eib.org. And you can also find the very specific details in the annex there. I'm happy to talk, if we have more time later, about how we, for instance, introduced an adapted economic test with stricter criteria in the road sector, which was one of the sectors that we discussed at length in the context of the Climate Bank roadmap. Another development that has happened in terms of our policy framework is that last year we approved the new transport lending policy in July. And this policy is based, and this is one point to be very clear on, is based on the eligibilities that we already decided in the Climate Bank roadmap. So the Climate Bank roadmap is the overarching umbrella under which everything we do is now considered. It was the transport lending policy as an update of our 2011 policy, and it aligns now with the major Commission policies, including the smart and sustainable mobility strategy that the Commission issued shortly after the approval of the Climate Bank roadmap. Due to the rapid changes in the sector and the decarbonization technologies, we've decided to cap our new transport lending policy so that it has a period of validity from 22 to 27, and we will look at it again in 25 through a mid-term review. So the priorities that we have decided in the new TLP is about basically around the sustainable transport, and we have developed a system that we called SASHE, where S stands for safe and secure, A stands for accessible, green stands for green and resilient, and E for efficient. So as you can see here, we're trying to be a bit broader than just the climate, but including other elements in our decision process. And with these priorities, we aim to find the best transport investments that are addressing the multiple challenges that we're facing in the sector. A final comment from my side is that we are also working at a resilience initiative for infrastructure, particularly in light of the climate changes, the climate requirements, and also focusing basically on preservation and upgrading of existing assets to future climate events and technological developments. So happy to talk about that a bit later. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Lise. I mean, Benjamin, you had started talking about that virtuous circle between investment, implementation, and ambition as well. And I think here we have that example, isn't it, of how you try to move across that pipeline. I thought it was also very interesting to the 2027 cap that you put there, understanding that there is a very changing landscape nowadays, so where would that take us? But anyway, conscious of time and wanting to make sure that we all stick to our promise, you might have noticed that there's a timekeeper. Salome is there on the first row trying to keep us, honest to our commitment. She's supporting me as well. So let's keep that commitment. And with no further ado, therefore, I'm going to pick up again another thread from Benjamin, which was, no, from you, Ben, sorry. I was mixing the Benjamins here. The information one. But let's talk about research in this case, isn't it, Lise? Because, Anne, sorry, I was still with Lise. Anne, because we do know that the high volume transport program of UK FCDO has been precisely looking into these information gaps, into these research gaps that are not there. Therefore, if you have that gap, how can you expect the policy or the decision making towards the investment to be based on what is needed? So tell us a bit more. What are the gaps that you are seeing there, and how is the HBT program trying to figure out how to better equip us with the knowledge?
Great. Thanks, Marusha. So the UK government has recognized that we can do projects, or we can do projects that are based on evidence of what works. And so we've been investing in research for a very long time. In the transport sector, we've been investing in research for 50 plus years. So we've got a long history in this space. So research that is having evidence-based research is important, but it's also important that it's research that is relevant, that is and that is easily communicated to policymakers and decision makers. And so that's where our programs come into play. So we've got a couple of flagship programs. Marusha mentioned the high volume transport research program. I'll point out that I'm going to have a lot of gaps in what I say, but our program director and program manager are here in the room, and you can talk to Bernard and Roxanne for the details that I don't cover. We've also got the Climate Compatible Growth Research Program, which is looking at that energy and transport side of climate and economic growth. And so it's a consortium of research institutions of universities. And so it's also playing into this space. And then we contribute to the World Bank in a couple of places, including the Development Impact Evaluation team in the IE Connect program, which is impact evaluations for the transport sector. And so they're doing a lot of really good work in the data and data systems space, as well as randomized control trials. So little plug there for the kinds of research that we're supporting. Some of the words that I've heard a lot this week: avoid, shift, improve. And I would say that our research programs are really trying to work in all three of those areas and provide evidence of what might work in those spaces, or what does work in those spaces. So for example, in the avoid space, we're doing some work with the ITDP on transit-oriented development. And we've also done a set of podcasts, so 2 column seasons of podcasts on transit-oriented development and ideas around that. So if, they're very accessible. They're about 25 minutes each and a really good listen, really easy listen. So, that's about translating that research into a way that's accessible. So transit-oriented development, just briefly for those who don't know, it's really an urban planning concept that brings residents closer to jobs and services, reduces the time and the environmental burden from transport, from traveling to and from jobs and services and so on. And so making cities that much more accessible and inclusive for the people who need them. And so the kinds of work that we're doing is taking that concept and trying to adapt it to the context of low-income countries. And that's primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. I think Benjamin mentioned HDM4, and I always get this acronym wrong, so I'm going to read it. Highway Development and Management Module. So I think I've got that right. So HDM4 is a critical analysis and appraisal tool. Benjamin here talked about cost-benefit analysis and the importance. I won't go into that. But HDM4 is a tool that's been used for decades. It's used by about 67 countries at the moment. It has, it's required by many of the MDBs in order to get loans in the transport space. So it's a tool that is mandatory to be able to get that funding. Now, the tool hasn't been updated since 2005, and so we're working with the World Bank as the lead. The Asian Development Bank is contributing. We're contributing. PIARC is contributing. I'm sure I'm forgetting partners, and I apologize to anybody I haven't mentioned. But we're looking to upgrade that tool to bring it into the 21st century. So some of the needs that we needed to bring into it, things like climate change, resilience, greenhouse gas emissions, road safety benefits, tertiary roads, wider economic benefits, and some of the sorts of things that Benjamin was talking about, although we have correlated that we're not overlapping here, we're complementing each other in this space. Things like indexing the real value and the time of time and life. And really importantly, I think, it's currently a PC-based tool, and we're looking to turn that into an online tool, which requires a lot of software development. So really important tool there, and lots of people contributing. I think we've been working since the 60s on these overseas road notes. And that's a series of very short road notes looking at various different aspects of road construction, of road systems, of road maintenance, and institutions and so on. Under HVT, we have just recently launched a new update to Road Note 31, which is about road surfaces. And that's bringing climate change resilience into the road surface construction side of things. So there's a good product that you can have a look at. There's other products. I'm conscious of time. I just want to very quickly also mention inclusion, because if you think about gaps in evidence, inclusion, both in terms of the context and in terms of inclusion of the voices of the most vulnerable. So we've been doing a lot of work on gender and various different aspects of gender in transport, both as users and as labor, and disability inclusion. So I won't go into the details there. I'm out of time, but we've got lots of products there. So talk to us, and we can fill you in more.
Thanks so very much. I mean, it's mixed feelings, isn't it? On the one hand, it's like, wow, so amazing that we got UK FCDO helping us, supporting all these research areas. And on the other hand, it's like, wow, did you see the list? Did you see all the gaps as well that we are, isn't it, having in terms of that knowledge and that research that we need to move into the right direction? So this is also an encouragement, I think, for all the young researchers, or not that young, researchers who are listening to us today, whether here in the room or online, to realize about these gaps that we are experiencing, and to feel motivated to join this course from their angle, their professional angle. So let's move now to Asia with Jamie. I mean, of course, every measure and the ability and the particular actions of a development bank are going to very much depend on the context of the region in which you're operating, isn't it? I mean, let's put a bit Asia into context very quickly here, if I may, Jamie. We look at the region, the global region, with the biggest increase in CO2 emissions in recent years, rocketing private car ownership rates, rather limited access to convenient public transport, booming population and urbanization, therefore quite an increase in demand for transport. Let's not even talk about freight. So quite a task in the ADB to try to jumpstart a Paris alignment process, isn't it? By which the transport investments can progressively move to different parameters. How are you going about that?
Thank you very much, Marisha. First off, we're doing it collaboratively. So yes, we're the Asian Development Bank, but we are working with many of our partners. And particularly when you relate to alignment with the Paris Agreement, all of the multilateral development banks have agreed collectively that sector operations, and by 2 years from now, 100% of private operations, all assistance must be aligned with the Paris Agreement, and that applies to all of the multilateral development banks. So by jump-starting it, it's a requirement now. There's no getting away from it. They go through that evaluation process. And this applies, so the same sort of approach is used by all the organizations, slightly tailored to specifics, but it must be aligned. It must be aligned on the mitigation side. It must be aligned on the adaptation side. But if you're talking the sort of global goods or the impact at scale, while that will be used for our project-type assistance, to have that impact at scale, the sort of missing pillar from projects meeting mitigation and adaptation has the transport sector got a Paris-aligned overarching approach that would deal both with the climate change issues and with the development issues. So one thing we are really focusing on is getting the policy components of that, particularly when it comes to decarbonization of transport, because while many governments refer under the NDCs or the LTSs, from the transport perspective back up for climate change, so a transport policy or a document may not reference that. And I think there was mention earlier on of every tool in the tool bag should be used, and that's indeed the case. But also, what are those tools and what's the likely time frame of those tools to be picked up? Just picking up on what you said in terms of Asia, the Asian Development Bank president says the battle for climate change will be won and lost in Asia. Of course, I'd say this being from the transport sector, but I believe that the battle for climate change will be won or lost in Asia in the transport sector for exactly the reasons you mentioned, that massive demand for mobility, both passengers and freight, huge. Just putting things in context, vehicle ownership at the household level is roughly around 20% in much of developing Asia. By comparison, in US, it's 80%. So how do we go on that Paris alignment trajectory without going to 80% household vehicle occupancy, as well as the freight side as well? On the other commitments we've made, this is a financial commitment. We are a financial institution, but we've set a target of $100 billion financial support, climate-related, by 2030. So again, saying that transport is a critical part of that, last year, transport accounted for 41% of ADB's climate finance. By far away the largest in terms of the mitigation side, primarily through better forms of, more efficient forms of transport in urban public transport, rail systems, and maritime systems as well. So being able to move more people and freight with fewer emissions. So that's why we're looking at those subsectors. But also on the adaptation side, slightly behind our agricultural sector there, but not far behind. And this is really picking up on sort of the HDM4. Can we manage road systems better so they become climate resilient? And this is sort of the combination that we really see as important of marrying the Sustainable Development Goals with the Paris alignment and the climate change goals. Can we support better road asset management so the life cycle cost of the transport assets is there? Can we do that in a resilient way to increase drainage, to ensure that we will be able to look at the future rainfall? And can we bring in road safety, 3-star or better in terms of the IRAP rating for the UN Decade of Action? So if we look at a road asset management side on that adaptation side as well. Very quickly on the knowledge, we're working with the Climate Compatible Growth and others, but it's really, the knowledge must be applied. We must undertake some pilots, ultimately to end to action. So this gets back to the jump starting. We have to use that knowledge, do the demonstration to show that things can happen. Some very quick 2 or 3 wheelers, e-buses, taxis, this has sort of reached the tipping point in much of Asia. Those are the better vehicles to purchase, e-vehicles, not combustion engine vehicles. But some proofs of concept on e-fishing boats, small fishing boats, e-ferries in Bangkok. If you go there, please have a look on the Chai Phraya River. That's something we supported. And hydrogen in the maritime. These may be higher hanging fruits. If there's such a thing as a low hanging, there's a higher hanging fruit. So maritime and aviation. But that decarbonisation pathway has to go through the whole list. And my final point is bringing it back to that sustainable development goal and the infrastructure gap and the financing gap. But what does that mean in terms of realities? Transport is an enabler of development, primarily because of the access and the mobility. Data is a big problem in transport, but our estimates are that 630 million people in Asia and the Pacific are more than 2 kilometers from an all-weather road. So that's poor rural access, 630 million. Poor access to quality urban transport, we estimate to be around 1.4 billion people. So between the poor rural access and the poor urban access, you're talking 2 billion people. So putting that infrastructure gap or that financing gap, that means that 2 billion people in Asia and the Pacific are not getting those accessibility options to education, to employment, to health services. And that's really what's important, and that's where the money to support the right types of investments under a more programmatic approach allows those benefits of the enabling part of transport to give them that access. Thank you.
Phenomenal. I mean, I couldn't possibly add anything there. You brought it down to people, which is what it's all about. Ben, time to go to the World Bank. I think that Benjamin at the beginning already mentioned the Climate Action Plan by the World Bank. Tell us a bit about it.
Okay, all right.
It's all about it, not just a bit.
Well, so the World Bank issued a 3 or 5-year climate change action plan, CCAP. So this is a new one. Transport is one of the transitions that I have to say. So there are 5 key transition areas in the CCAP: energy, transport, industry, agriculture, forgetting the 5th one. So those are the main ones. Yeah, we'll come back. Now, it also has 3 key elements that are relevant for our discussion here. One is to make all of our World Bank operations, including both investment and policy loans, allied to the Paris Agreement by July 2023. IFC is also supposed to be there, so there's the World Bank group, but I think they have 1 extra year to be fully compliant, but they would start on July 2023. Secondly, we will do a diagnostic, country-level diagnostic, what we call Climate and Development, CCDR, Country Climate Development Report. Essentially looking at a country level, the win-wins or the trade-offs between development and climate. So that way, country, when they develop a program, they're not just thinking about development and then climate separately, rather in an integrated way. So that CCDR is being done now as a core diagnostic work for many countries. Already we've done more than 33 countries last fiscal year. Similar numbers are coming. So each country that receives World Bank lending, they will have the CCDR before what we call the country partnership framework. Country strategy is discussed. So it's an input to that. And there also transport is clearly mentioned or is being done to see what are the different pathways that each country would take. So the Vietnam CCDR, for example, includes very good discussion on that. And if you go to Malawi, it talks a lot about resilient infrastructure to make sure about resilience. So depending on the country, there are some emphasis on which way the climate is going to inform the transport lending program. And then the third one, finally, in the CCAP is the finance. So World Bank, all World Bank target for climate finance is 35% of our everything loan. That includes education, policy loans, et cetera, But if you add it up, 35% of the financing would go for climate. Now, in the transport sector, we're already at 56, so we're actually higher than the corporate target. So I think there's a lot happening within the climate sphere in the transport sector, I have to say. In the Paris alignment, we're developing now the sector guidance note already and the methods to actually screen projects, appraise them, and making sure that they are also complied. But it's not just only compliant, but how can you use this Paris alignment as an entry point to also accelerate decarbonization of the transport sector and make it more resilient. So I think people are kind of, confused, in my view, this notion between, okay, aligning your project to the Paris Accord and actually meeting the climate goals of bringing down emissions from transport by 2035. So the climate goals would require significant amount of funding beyond what that MDB project is. So we have, $100 million. Okay, we're fully aligned, we're going to do that, but for that country to meet the Paris goals, they're going to require billions. So you really need to also look at how are you going to accelerate the development, how are you going to bring finance. So here's a plug for the next session for all of you to come and listen, because we have distinguished speakers that are going to tell you where the money is going to come from. But so it is something I think we need to go beyond just, this is what, at least the way we're approaching it, rather than making this, a takeoff thing that is required, but rather making it a discussion within the international committee with our clients. How are we going to work? How are we going to partner together to bring private sector financing, climate financing? How do we use the MDB, it's a kind of scarce IDA and IBRD resources to leverage other types of financing. So I think that clarity is really super important as we discuss what we mean by Paris alignment and Paris goals. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ben. We started a bit late, but my calculation is that we still have some 18, 20 minutes for you here in the room and also online. I know that we have a few questions online lined up, but let me take a check here in the room and start lining up there behind the microphone as you've done in previous sessions. I'm pretty sure that there's something. And you can be provocative. I mean, here, you got people who are used, to receiving a lot of pressure, whether it is from member states, from other people. So let's be provocative, because we do know, we are all very aware that this conversation has been going on for very long, isn't it? The Paris alignment of the portfolios from multilateral development banks is something that we've been talking about for a while already. I already see one person lining up there, Felipe. It's lovely. Thanks for breaking the ice. I need a few more, and I really want to encourage you to go. There's couple of questions online, I understand. Felipe, we start with you, and then I take the question from you, and I see more people lining up behind the mic. Yeah. Felipe, let's go.
Yeah, so you said provocative. There's this thing where financing is normally done by the development banks in very large amounts. But we also know that if we can leverage or promote the work of smaller organizations locally, we will be more effective in the long term. So I'm wondering how, if you find a way out of that conundrum, like it's very difficult to finance 1,000 small NGOs, just procedurally it's a headache. So yeah, is there a way out, I guess?
Okay, so from the micro to the micro, how do we reconcile that? Are we ready to convey what we are hearing online? Let's go ahead.
Sure. So I'll read the 2 questions. We have 3 questions, so I'll read the 2 of them. To decide which transport development paths to follow, that is, which projects to fund, which input information, data, etc., do you need to support your decision making? What has the greatest impact on your decisions? It's a general question to all the panelists. How do research and innovation actors need to communicate this input to you so that you can use it most effectively to support your decision making? Examples like interactions at conferences, reports, data dashboards, etc.
Okay, so we had the question from Carlos Felipe. We had the question about what do you actually look for? What is the most impactful thing you look for when you're making the decision? Who wants to get started? I mean, the questions were clear here, so this is a debate. Come on, and I really want to encourage you again, please, to go and join the microphone. The moment I see you, I will go back to you.
I can start. Well, at EIB, we have a quite extensive due diligence criteria and questionnaire that we send out. And then we have an additionality framework where we rank projects. So projects need to meet Pillar 1, which is a strategic policy orientation. Most of to use a road example of the projects we finance in the EU, have to be located on the TEN-T network, which is the Commission's priority list of projects. We use the same global gateway prioritization, previously very close to PIDA in Africa, for instance, when we prioritize road projects. So that's the first pillar. Second pillar has several elements where growth, economic rate of return is a key factor, employment is another factor. So that's to do the economic assessment, we obviously need very detailed cost analysis. We need very detailed traffic assumptions that we then assess, and then we overlay those with our own assumptions on EV penetration, reduction in traffic growth following the shift mode, so that we will see a lower demand for transport in the future for road transport. And then on the third pillar, we look at the value contribution from the bank. So it's an extensive process that we go through.
I see. I think, Jamie, no, sorry. No.
No, I just wanted to add on the what we look for or how we're thinking about this. So, as I mentioned, we have this country climate and development report. So for the transport sector, we look at what are the different pathways to decarbonize the transport sector and make it resilient. And then we also have a number of flagship studies that are looking at what should countries do. So we talked a lot about avoid, shift, and improve, and making it resilient. So depending on the country, depending on the level of motorization they have, then there is a modeling exercise that we do to determine what kind of trajectory are we looking at. And if we introduce more public transport, how would that what would it look like? If we introduce electrification, what would it look like? Or active mobility. So those kind of the modeling and scenario planning are the ones that actually inform us in terms of what kind of transportation program that we would do for that country. You know, especially those countries that actually say electrification is going to solve the decarbonization issue. That is actually what the modeling shows is that's not enough. Even in countries like China, where they're accelerating in e-mobility adoption, you still need public transport, you still need active mobility, and reduction of in vehicles miles traveled, just generally. So we just need to drive less and be more active. So those are the kind of things that I think we have to do before we go to project level assessment, the way Liz was describing it. Yeah.
Can I just add?
Let me see if there was somebody else, because Jamie, I thought you were.
Yeah, very.
Yeah, and I see already somebody, a gentleman over there, wanting to also pose all the questions. So
it's a little bit of a push and a pull. Push internally because we set our agendas. So Paris alignment, 1st of July this year, as an example, that is what we would push internally, and then a pull from what our governments are seeking assistance with, and so a combination of those. And yes, we have our program to develop the future pipeline, but it's the dialogue, it's the knowledge that is leading to not the 3-year pipeline, but what sort of assistance 5 to 10 years, how is that emerging? And I think that's also very important to look at the marrying between the push and the pull, but continuing those discussions, looking at knowledge, applying that knowledge so we get better assistance in the future. And to the first point, technical assistance as well as financial project or programmatic big finance of support of actual actions on the ground. The technical assistance is also very important in terms of getting some of that knowledge, applying that knowledge, and using that to develop those larger scale financial support downstream. Thanks.
Shall I come in on the first question and maybe the
and the research, how to communicate the research, perhaps? I wonder if you want to pick up that one, Anne?
Yeah, I was thinking that one as well a little bit. So Felipe, thanks for that great point about small organizations. And you're right, there is a huge tension between the number of organizations working at the local level and our ability to contract with them. And so things like consortia really help because, you know, it takes as much effort to manage a small contract as it does a large one. And so we just can't do a lot of small contracts. But the other thing, by having things like the program management unit that we've got for the high volume transport program, they can go out to smaller organizations, and we do work with smaller organizations that way. So it's not our primary contract, but it would be a second or a third tier party. So we do, you know, there are ways to get involved in ways that we do look to engage with you. On the communications tools, I mean, that's my question back to all of you in the audience. How do we communicate effectively with you, and what sorts of tools work? But having said that, we do try to apply our research and to communicate it as like tools and guidelines and the road notes, and really translate things into much more usable small bites and translated out of academic language into everyday language that's more accessible for policymakers. So it's not a great, you know, it's not a complete answer, and we'd love to hear from you about what works in that. We also evaluate our programs and have indicators for all of this kind of thing. So we'd love to hear from you if you've got suggestions.
Thank you. Ben, I'm very conscious of the fact you had been coming, but I'm also conscious of the note that I've just received from the organizers. We have a sharp stop in just a few moments. So let me take your question, please, and of course give the floor to you, Ben, and to Lise, that I know you were waiting, and encourage you three perhaps to have a very succinct final remark. Think about it as a tweet. That's really how we have to think about it, yeah? So, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Oscar Hernandez. This has been an amazing panel, and my question is about financing. We've been hearing from you many ideas on how to assess projects, how to prioritize them, and you know, make sure that they will, based on a good planning, make sure that they will work in the future to meet the goals that were set at the beginning of those projects. But at the end, I would like to hear from you ideas about how to, at the end, instrumentalize how to internalize those externalities that we are trying to actually incorporate in all these systems in order to leverage financing and at the same time reducing the impact of those situations that currently are not working as they should be or we expect to see.
Thanks very much. So let's start a blitz round, starting with you, Ben. And Lisa, I know you had something else to say. Let's keep it tight, yeah?
Yeah, very tight.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent, excellent question. I think the good news is that I think that the tools widely exist. I think that they're out there, and I think what we're increasingly finding is that there's a bit of a it's sort of in a kind of a no-loss situation, you can really, you can really invest in this. Many arguments are that it takes time, it takes too money to conduct these kinds of assessments, but in reality, many of them can be done alongside other assessments that are currently being undertaken, for instance, environmental impact assessments or safeguards reviews. So definitely the tools exist, and the benefits seem to definitely outweigh the costs in terms of applying them for future financing.
Thank you. Now, I just wanted to add in terms of the criteria, we obviously look at climate risk assessment. We subject our projects to quite a detailed scrutiny in terms of whether the project is sufficiently climate proof to be standing along its economic life. And then environmental concerns are obviously also very important, environmental and social. So just to conclude, yeah.
And perhaps I wait and skip you, and that way you can reflect a bit more on your tweet. I know you've just taken the floor. Shall I go to Jamie, then Binjan, and then I give it to Anne, perhaps, to have that tweet? Yeah, that's the plan? Great.
The demands are high. The demands are high for new infrastructure. The demands are probably even higher for operational efficiencies and upkeep. But the money is scarce. So I think the tweet would be something along, we have to use that money well. We have to leverage how that money can come in, looking at innovative finance, but increasingly moving away from project to a programmatic approach, which allows the leveraging and the financing to start to meet the requirements for that, but coming from other sources. Governments, some, development organizations, some, but relatively small or very small in comparison. It's really looking at other finances sources, particularly private sector financing, how that can be brought in. And I think that programmatic approach will allow the de-risking of that. But if it's project by project, we're going to be here an awful long time trying to address some of these issues on sustainable development goals as well as climate change. Thank you.
Thanks. Binjan, please.
No, I think that's exactly right. The supply of finance is out there, actually, to be honest. There are quite a lot of institutional investors that want to invest in infrastructure, ECG, ESG investors that want to invest on climate-compatible projects. But what we don't have is the well-thought-out demand. So I think as development professionals, we need to work on the demand side to identify the risks, to identify the projects, aggregate them into a program so that we aggregate the demand and help take that into the market in such a way that others would make it attractive. Otherwise, this gap for financing is always going to be there, and you will have always this coordination failure between demand and the supply of funds. So I think the tweet is we need to address coordination failure between demand and supply.
Okay, financing. That's quite a tweet. Can you match that?
I can make it shorter, please. So I'm not going to duplicate. I could say ditto to everything else. My tweet is, so it's different, evidence matters and inclusion is crucial.
Okay, wow, phenomenal. So I hope that next year, when we have another session like this again, because we will need to continue discussing this, we know it, we're going to be reporting about a wealth of a really broad portfolio of projects that are really going, because we're going to actually match that demand with the ambition that is there. They could actually be projects that are not just about decarbonizing or not just about inclusivity, that we actually mixed in the best possible mix, those different notions, that they respond, therefore, to evidence, absolutely, and that they have got a programmatic approach, and they also leverage the private funding that we require. So thank you very much, panel. Thanks to Benjamin, to Ben, to Lise, to Anne. Gosh, what a long list of panelists we had today. To Jamie and to Ben. Thanks very much to all of you here and in the room, and see you around.